Welcome to this first lesson in Perspectives of Communication Theory. Today we are going to briefly just do a quick flyover of one of the topics in Chapter 1, and that is the models and definition of communication. And we're going to explore this as a means of kind of diving into what is theorizing in communication. And we'll talk more about this in class, but I want you to get a picture in your mind of theory as simply the ways in which we try to explain the way people communicate, why they communicate, how they communicate, and the outcomes of their communication. So as we're trying to come up with explanations for how and why people communicate, we come up with theories. So this lesson is going to begin to unpack the definition of communication and then look at several historical models of communication and where we are today. And then we'll finish up with just a really brief history of how the communication field has evolved in colleges and universities. So first, let's take a stab at defining communication. If you pause the video right now, I want you to just jot down a quick and dirty definition of what you think communication is if you were trying to define it. Don't look it up, don't look in your book, just try to define it off the top of your head. What do you think it includes? I want you to, as you're thinking about communication, begin to see how complex it is. And so if you think about this definition by a scholar named Selnow, he said it's the process of sending and receiving verbal and nonverbal messages, and what we're trying to do in that process is create shared meaning. Communication, if you look at that word, communia, and munia is a Greek and then Latin root for sharing. And so co-sharing, this idea that you are in a relationship of some sort and you're sharing a message. And so he breaks it down. He's got a couple of important words in here. One is that there's a sending and receiving going on, that the message is also multidimensional. I've got verbal components to the message and nonverbal components to the message. And then it's also a process, and we're going to dig more into that word in class, but a process is not something that is a finite act, but it's something that evolves. It's a process, or it's a series of steps that becomes a process. And then the idea of meaning. How are you creating meaning? That alone, just meaning in and of itself, is a really interesting phenomenon. So if you think about all the things in there, that's a very sophisticated process that we're involved in, that we're having to monitor a lot that's going on. We're having to learn a lot before we can even communicate. Think about watching a child, an infant, begin to acquire language and learn the rules and rituals for communication. I've got a couple of grandchildren right now, very young, from infant to 2 years old. And it's fascinating, once again, to just watch these little humans and the way they acquire their ability to communicate, the things that they go through, the learning stages, and all of that just really reinforces or tells us once again how amazingly complex and sophisticated this thing is that we all do. Now that you're grown, we do it pretty naturally. Here's another definition by Verteber, and he says it's the process of creating or sharing. So now we've got this creational aspect in his definition, meaning, there that word is again. And then he goes into several different scenarios or situations, and he says in informal conversation, group interaction, or public speaking. So he takes this situational approach in his definition, but he still includes this idea that it's a process and it's creating a shared meaning. Now your textbook uses this definition: social process in which individuals employ symbols. There's the first time we've seen that. The idea that we have symbols, and that's going to become a word that we're going to want to unpack. And we use those symbols to establish, interpret, and co-create meaning in environments. So let's dive into the models. And these models evolved over time in the field of communication. And I'm going to take you through 3 primary versions of the model of communication. We won't spend a ton of time on each one because they are also talked about in your book. But I want to highlight a few things about each model, and I want to show you the limitations of each model. So this first model was developed by a couple of scholars. One was a communication scholar, Claude Shannon, and he worked with another electrical engineer by the name of Weaver. And Shannon and Weaver came up with this model that really mirrored their, from the mindset of it being an electronic signal that's being transmitted. For each of these models, I'm going to give you a metaphor that might help you to remember kind of the features of the model and what the limitations are. And the metaphor I want you to have in mind for this model is bowling, and you'll see why here in a second. So this model says that there's a sender or a source of a message, and think of a radio transmitter. So you've got a radio station. This sender or source sends this message, and then it's being electronically transmitted over the airwaves to a target or a receiver, right? So, and that message has to go through different obstacles. It can be semantic obstacles, things that maybe it's because of the language that we're using that it creates what we call noise. Or maybe there's a physical obstacle. There can be psychological noise. This happens to us all the time, right? You're sitting in class, you've got a lesson you're supposed to be paying attention to, but you're tuning out because you've got something going on in your mind. There's things you're thinking about, psychological noise. Or it could be physiological noise. I had knee surgery recently, and as that knee is healing, there's certain amount of pain or discomfort, and that physiological noise can distract me from communication in one way or another. So this was their message. You can see that it's one way. The message is going in one direction from the sender to the receiver. And so from a 1949 perspective, in the age of, radio clearly was well established, television just getting established, but they are definitely thinking that this message, both radio and TV at the time, and even telephones, if you picked up the telephone, which at the time was attached to a wall with a cord, and that phone, one person spoke, the other person listened. And in some cases, you had to be connected. In the early days of telephone, you had to be connected by an operator. So you'd pick up the phone and wind the phone up, get some power in there, and then talk to the operator and say, please connect me to Harry down the lane. It was actually a physical connection facilitated by that operator in some central location. So that's the mindset, the model that they had in mind as they're thinking about this message that goes from a sender to a receiver. So what are some of the limitations? One, that the message is somehow singular, right? That you've got this singular message that's going down this tube or this line from one person, one place, one source to one receiver. It's also finite. You've got a beginning of that message and an end of that message. So there was kind of a simplistic electronic one-way model that they were limited by what they knew technologically, environmentally, how communication was happening. And they obviously were biased because of their training in electronic engineering. And they also saw this target or this receiver at the time. The person on the end of the radio could not talk back, could not send any kind of message back through the line to the origin, the source, or the television was the same way. So they saw it that way. They saw the listener as this passive sponge that just soaked things in. Some of the early media communication models reflected a little bit of that spongeness. One model was called the hypodermic needle model. And it was like they had this medicine, this treatment, and they just stuck this needle into the audience and injected them with whatever the message was that they were telling and creating. So that is the linear model. You can see bowling. I've got the bowling ball, and I'm going to hurl it down the lane, and that bowling ball is the message, and it's going to smack those pins and do whatever it does to them. It was a one-way interaction. The pins are defenseless. They just got to take it. Okay, so that's our linear model. The second stage of this model, you can see it didn't take very long. 1954, 1955, Wilbur Schramm thought, there's more to the process that's going on here. And so our metaphor turns from bowling to ping pong. And what he's going to add is this idea, you've got this message, and there's more to that message than just a one-way transaction or one-way message going in one direction. And so the first thing that he pointed out was the two-way dimension of a message, that a message is going out, but at the same time there's feedback that's coming back to the person who sent the message, that encoder, to the source of the message. So the idea that the message is two-way was a kind of an innovation of this model, but also that there was a recognition of a response. And as we'll actually refine this in the third and final model, but this idea that there is a recourse, there is a message that can come back, but this also brought into the picture this idea that everybody has a field of experience that they operate from. The shaping influences, my history and my experiences, and all of that is going to shape how I communicate and the ways in which I communicate. Right? So you can see ping pong is a better metaphor here, where I'm hitting the ball, but I'm also adjusting because I know that ball is coming right back. And that ball is the message, but it's being batted back and forth. It's still the message, goes from one paddle to the other, but there's an immediate response, right? And if I put a little spin on the ball, you've got to adjust to that and hit it so that you can reflect the spin back to me and not hit it off the table or lose the point. It still had limitations, though. The sender and receiver are separate roles, and the feedback seems only to originate from the receiver role. So those were two limitations of this model, which takes us to our third model, the transactional model. And our metaphor here is going to be a game of charades, and you'll see why here, and I think in a second. So here we've got two communicators. Notice that we've positioned them differently. You've got two communicators, but their fields of experience are not entirely separate. You've got each person with their historical, cultural, situational experience that has shaped them, but they might share something. If they're communicating, there's usually some space in this Venn diagram that they share. Okay, so that's really important, that we have this mutual intersecting point. Something else this model brings into the picture is this idea of multiple contexts and time, and that our interactions are context specific. Sometimes they can exist over several different contexts and over several different time periods. So we have these interactions using symbols, and there's interaction from time 1, time 2, time 3, and so we build up a history of communication. And sometimes with individuals, sometimes between groups. This helps to begin to explain a lot and really flesh out those fields of experience and how communication between different groups has evolved over time. You can see how this might even play out in an international context. For instance, the U.S. and our current relationship with Russia. And if you go back in time, even to World War II, where we were allies, and then the Soviet Union formed, and then the Cold War started, all of that evolves to where we are today. You can see how over time that history changes how we interact with people and how we communicate. So this model tries to incorporate some of that. And the big influence here is that the model tries to capture this constructivist concept of co-creation, that we don't create a message and then send it to each other like a ping pong ball, but like charades, we are co-creating a message. I have an idea of what I'm trying to communicate to you. You have an idea of what you think I'm trying to communicate, and together we are evolving and creating that message. And we are adjusting to each other as we're trying to come up with a mutually understandable idea. It's almost like if there were a potter wheel between us and there's a lump of clay on it, and we're both trying to form a jar or a pot, and we've got both of our hands on this clay forming and molding and shaping it as that wheel's spinning and that clay is taking shape. So that's what we mean by co-creation. So you can see this model emphasizes simultaneity, that things are happening at the same time. While I'm speaking to you, I'm also aware in certain environments of your responses, and I'm adjusting and adapting based upon those responses. So this idea of sending and receiving is happening simultaneously. And then the constructivist idea that we are creating something together, that it's emergent. It's not something that existed and that I give to you and you have to deconstruct. It's something that we are co-creating and making together. And the idea that there is a relational component to this, that it's not just a verbal message, it's a nonverbal message, it's all of the paralanguage that I'm using, and so all of that is wrapped up into this model. So the models, I want you to see that they exist for us as heuristic devices. They help us to think about communication. And if you think about any communication in any environment, in any relationship, if you start assigning these labels to parts of that communication process or that text or that event, that communication happening, you can begin to identify aspects of that communication that help you understand it and make sense of it. And that's exactly what we're doing in communication theory. We are often taking a model and applying it and trying to understand what's taking place so that we can either optimize it or make it better or eliminate problems. And so all of that is why we create theories that help us to either organize our experience and try to make sense of something. What just happened there? And we apply a theory or these concepts and terms so that we can kind of unpack it and make sense of it. Or sometimes we're trying to extend how we understand something. Wow, I don't get what's happening, what's taking place there. So we apply the models, we apply the terminology, come up with new terminology to try to extend how we think about or know something. Sometimes it's to stimulate and guide more research on something. Like we want to understand how best to communicate a health intervention to a certain community. So we study the communication that's been happening. We study other kinds of communication. We try to stimulate and guide research on that area. Sometimes it's just to focus our attention. We want to know, wow, here's all the pieces in this model. We really want to do this or understand this piece of it because that seems to be the crux of something. So sometimes theories help us do that. Sometimes they just simply provide a map or a framework that we can lay out all the pieces and understand it more clearly. Sometimes they help us, if we can lay out a theory, we can then create postulates or theorems or things that we can test and so that we can predict outcomes. If I do this in a lecture, I'm more likely to achieve better outcomes in student papers or on exams, right? So sometimes the theories are designed to do that. Sometimes the theories are just designed to be triggers for change. We know that something has to happen. We need to trigger a change. We're in a bad course of action. We're in a bad flow, and we've got to trigger that change. And so the theory, we put it together so that we can try to trigger something new, some kind of change. Well, that is a brief intro into the models of and theorizing in human communication. This is just a beginning of our study. We are going to look at so many different frameworks and theories that help us to understand how scholars explain communication in a myriad of different contexts. We will see you guys soon.